All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Sites Hybrid Speaker Night. So nice to have an in-person audience, our dedicated in-person audience here with us in Buffalo, New York. So nice again to see people face to face. My name is Lenora Henson, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site. I want to thank each of you for joining us. For those of you who aren't familiar with the TR site, we preserve the home where Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office on September 14th, 1901, to become the nation's 26th president in the wake of William McKinley's assassination at the Pan American Exposition. We are Western New York's only national park site, and although we are actually managed on a daily basis by a local foundation that is also responsible for raising nearly $500,000 each year to keep our doors open. In that vein, I want to say a special thank you to all the TR site members. I know we have a few here with us tonight. Your support is always appreciated, but even more so as we continue to navigate our way and come out of the pandemic and all of the uncertainty that comes along with it. The TR Sites monthly speaker night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to help us think about some of the issues that were relevant during TR's time, during his presidency, and those that continue to be relevant today. We couldn't do this without the generous financial support of our series sponsors, so our thanks go out to Erie County and the New York State Council on the Arts. In case you're new to speaker night, I should also mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record nearly all of our speakers for the past 4 years. So if you've missed any of them, I'd encourage you to check out the recordings on our YouTube channel. Tonight, I'm delighted to bring you Erin Hatton, and she's going to be talking about her book, which is called Coerced: Work Under Threat of Punishment. Dr. Hatton is an associate professor of sociology at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her research is centered in the sociology of work, while also extending into the fields of race and gender, social inequality, culture, labor, law, and social policy. Her first book, The Temp Economy: From Kelly Girls to Permatemps in Post-War America, weaves together gender, race, class, and work in a cultural analysis of the temporary help industry and the rise of the new economy. The Temp Economy won an honorable mention for the Distinguished Scholarly Monograph Award from the American Sociological Association's Labor and Labor Movements section. Her newest book, as I mentioned, Coerced: Work Under the Threat of Punishment, was published just last year, and it analyzes 4 very different and unusual groups of workers: incarcerated, workfare, college athletes, and graduate student workers. She drew on more than 120 in-depth interviews with across these 4 groups, and she uncovers a new form of labor coercion and analyzes its consequences for workers in America. Especially with the one of the recent Supreme Court decisions. I think this is a very timely topic, and I can't wait to hear how she frames this all. Dr. Hatton is also editor of the book Labor and Punishment: Work in and Out of Prison. And we're delighted to have her. This is actually her second time as part of our speaker series. She was one of our very earliest speakers back in 2015, I believe. So we're delighted to welcome her back. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Hatton. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here today. So yes, I'm going to talk about my new book, which came out right at the start of the pandemic, called Coerced: Work Under Threat of Punishment. And as Lenora said, in this book, I examine 4 really different groups of workers: prisoners, welfare recipients, student athletes, and graduate students. And I analyze them as workers specifically. I compare their labor relations and the power dynamics that undergird those labor relations. And ultimately, I argue that all of these very, very different groups of workers experience the same type of labor coercion. But I must say right here at the outset that I'm not arguing in any way that these workers are the same, right? That they differ in so many levels, particularly in terms of their vulnerability and their social marginalization. Prisoners are far removed from college athletes, right? College athletes are not prisoners. And likewise, welfare recipients are far removed from graduate students. These are incredibly different groups. Even still, I do find that each of these groups of workers experiences the same type of labor coercion, but a type of labor coercion that had not previously been identified by researchers who study work and labor. Um, but even though they all experience the same type of labor coercion, they don't experience to the same degree or the same intensity. Similar to the way that high wage workers and low wage workers both experience economic coercion, right? Losing their job would have pretty harsh economic consequences for both lawyers and day laborers, but not the same way, not the same intensity, right? So they experience the same type of coercion, but to different degrees. And that's what I'm analyzing here across these four divergent groups of workers. But in point of fact, when I started my research for this book, I did not set out to study labor coercion. That wasn't my focus. That wasn't my interest. It wasn't even on my radar. I actually was interested in studying various groups of workers who were not covered by labor and employment laws. So workers who didn't count as employees to qualify for the minimum wage or overtime or to be able to unionize. So I set out to interview first incarcerated workers, and I interviewed over 40 recently released prisoners from New York State prisons about their labor behind bars, because in fact, most able-bodied prisoners are required to work for a few cents an hour. After prisoners, I then interviewed Workfare workers. These are welfare recipients who are required to participate in, quote, work experience programs. They are required to perform labor as a condition of their receipt of welfare. So they're also known as Workfare workers, that's what I call them. So in order to get public assistance, like cash assistance, utility vouchers, subsidized childcare, they work for 25 or 35 hours a week. Typically in Buffalo, for example, they pick up trash in the parks, or maybe they work in open parks for sure. They also work in other nonprofits doing various jobs. Then later, after a few research detours, I interviewed college athletes, specifically Division I football and basketball players, about their work as athletes for their colleges. And then I also interviewed graduate students in the sciences who labor while getting their PhDs in the labs of their advisors. So they're performing their advisors' work, their advisors' research, as well as their own research. It's kind of one and the same on the way to get their PhD. Through more than 120 interviews with these four groups of workers, I discovered that the dynamics that most immediately shaped their labor relations was not really their exclusion from labor law, right? What I had intended to study. They weren't really concerned with not getting the minimum wage for the most part. But rather, the dynamics that shaped their labor relations, were the other forms of power that their bosses wielded over them, the coercion under which they labored. But in point of fact, nowadays, most scholars of work and labor don't really talk a whole lot about coercion. It's a bit passé. It's simply taken as a given that economic coercion undergirds labor relations. You know what Marx talked about way back when. It's like, yes, it's coercive. We have to work or we starve. So, so what? And so with that foundation implicitly in place, the main focus of contemporary research on work is precarity, the instability, the insecurity, and the low wages of lots of different types of work, like gig work and temp work and freelancing and day labor and so on. And really what precarity is a consequence of the economic coercion that bosses wield, right? They have the power to hire and fire you, to promote you or to demote you. They have power over your access to money, and that's a great power indeed. But these dynamics of precarity, this economic coercion, this power to hire and fire, that wasn't really the power that was shaping the work lives of these four groups of workers. Because in prison, for example, much more than being worried about losing their jobs and losing their minuscule wages, although they really did they needed their wages, but even more than that, incarcerated workers were concerned with the other types of power that their bosses wielded over them. So, for instance, if they don't comply with virtually any command from a corrections officer, who is their boss while they're working in prison, they can face a range of punitive consequences, which usually entail losing all of the basic entitlements, the human entitlements that become privileges behind bars. So they can lose their family visits, their phone use and socializing. They can lose being able to go out to their rec yard, recreation and movement. They can lose access to edible food and consumer goods and toiletries through the commissary, right? They do something wrong, they don't get to go to the commissary to spend their money. And then also, one of the most common consequences is being put in solitary confinement, which is an enclosed and segregated cell for 23 hours a day without human interaction, which in fact has been classified as a form of torture by the UN. Yet this form of torture is not at all an uncommon consequence for prisoners in the United States. Tens of thousands of people are kept in solitary confinement. For some, decades. Not for some it's years, for some it's decades at a time, kept in solitary. And this is the type of power that incarcerated workers' bosses wield over them. If you don't do what I say, I can send you to the box, which is New York State prisoners' name for solitary confinement. In Workfare, for example, if those workers do not comply with, again, virtually any demand from their worksite bosses or their caseworkers, they can be sanctioned, which means that they lose their public assistance, they lose their welfare benefits, including their cash benefits. They can lose rent and utility subsidies, they can lose their health care, their food or SNAP benefits, they can lose subsidized childcare and their transportation assistance. In other words, they lose access to all of those programs which are essential to families in poverty. And although these sanctions are usually temporary, right? They might last a month, they might last 3 months, their effects are permanent. In effect, they actually reduce welfare recipients' lifetime allotment of public assistance. So under the 1996 law, TANF, is said that everyone has 60 months public assistance over the course of their lives. That's 5 years. After 5 years, you're cut off. When you're sanctioned, let's say you're sanctioned for 3 months of time, your 60-month clock keeps ticking, so you lose your lifetime access, even though you are cut off from those benefits and not receiving it. So you lose your lifetime allotment of public assistance. And also, of course, there are long-term consequences of extreme poverty, including homelessness for these workers and their families when they are sanctioned, which are, of course, severe and long-lasting. And again, much like sending incarcerated workers to solitary confinement, sanctions are pretty common. Most often, welfare workers don't even know why they have been sanctioned. Oftentimes, it's out of error in the ridiculously bureaucratic welfare system. And they can grieve it, they can push back, but it requires a lot of jumping through hoops, a lot of red tape. Most often, they just sit it out. Perhaps they end up on the streets until they can get back on their feet. Their bosses wield a great deal of power over them. Now, meanwhile, for the other two groups of university student workers in my study, the punitive power that their bosses wield is much less severe, though it is still far-reaching and punitive in nature. So for athletes, for example, if they don't comply with their coach's directives, which, by the way, can include going to practice instead of going to counseling with a mental health counselor. It can also include, as one interviewee told me, what major you major in. He had a friend, another football player, who wanted to be an engineer. The coach said, what are you talking about? You can't be an engineering major. And the engineering schedule is incredibly rigorous and it conflicts with football practice. Why don't you go be a sociology major? That's literally what he told him. I'm a sociologist. But yes, Or so, you know, if they wanted to major in pre-med, if they wanted to be an engineer and they actually did that, the consequences will include losing playing time. That is, which doesn't sound like that big a deal actually to non-athletes, but it's actually incredibly a big deal for these athletes because they're at the peak of their careers. This, for the vast majority of them who will not go on to play professionally, this is it. This is the acme of their career at this Division I school. What they've worked their lives to get, and not being able to play, not being able to reach that acme is a severe consequence indeed. But the coaches can also curtail, so not only their playing time, but also future opportunities. So coaches act as informal referrals to professional recruiters. The recruiter will come around and talk to the coaches about the athletes. And if you're a bad egg, if you're a bad seed, if you don't follow orders, you're not going to be recommended to be recruited professionally. And of course, coaches control the athletes' access to scholarships and thus education and all the credentials it offers and the future professional opportunities that that may confer. The same is true of PhD students. If they don't comply with their advisor's directives, which could include, for example, working through the weekend, working 80, 90 hours a week, working on holidays, etc., they could be kicked out of the lab, which means that they lose their funding, they lose their position, and in order to stay in graduate school and complete their education, they have to find another lab, another advisor willing to take them on and start over in their research. So the whole thing starts over again. So they can lose their access to this kind of elite degree in this elite career. They can also miss out on, even if they're kept in the lab, if they're not in good standing with their advisor, they'll lose access to publishing papers. Because in the sciences, I don't know if you have seen a science paper, but there's usually a long list of authors in the order of importance, with the advisor, the PI of the lab, principal investigator of the lab, as last, indicating ownership. The advisor owns everything. They own the patents, they own the publications, they own everything that comes out of their lab, and they determine who is an author on that paper and in what order, and including whether a student gets to be counted as an owner of a patent. They have a lot of control of the products that come out of their lab. And so again, if you're not working through the weekend, if you're not working through Christmas, you may not be included in those high profile publications. And of course, through very important letters of recommendation, PhD advisors control effectively whether graduate students get jobs in their field. Now, of course, not all faculty advisors, not all coaches, not all caseworkers and corrections officers deploy these punitive powers at all, or at least they don't all do so in mean-spirited ways, right? But those who do are not bad apples. They're not exceptions to the rule. They are the rule. This is simply how things are done in these workplaces, right? Their access to these punitive powers are simply a matter of course in these labor relations. And as a result, this access remains unquestioned by workers and supervisors alike. This is just how things are done. If a prisoner doesn't comply with an officer's orders, he's probably going to be put in solitary confinement. That's just a rule. You've got to comply. If a Workfare worker does not adhere to her supervisor's directives, she may very well be sanctioned, right? She's being insubordinate. She'll be cut off of welfare. And if it's your second offense, you can be cut off for 3 months. If your third offense, you can be cut off forever. If an athlete doesn't comply with the coach's dictates, she will likely lose playing time. Her scholarship could be revoked. She could lose access to education. And if a graduate student does not follow his advisor's directives, he may very well lose his advisor's support for future employment. His whole career is at stake. Thus, I argue that all of these workers, in different ways and to different degrees, they labor under the threat of punishment. Whether or not they experience such punishment, all of these workers are acutely aware of the punitive power that their supervisors can wield. And this awareness pervades the workplace, fundamentally shaping their actions and their experiences, their whole work lives. Their labor is coerced. But this type of coercion that I'm talking about here is different from the economic coercion that we're used to thinking about or accept as part of everyday work lives, which is really predicated on employers' power to hire, fire, promote, and demote workers. Do I have a box here? No, I don't. Okay. Now, although these workers do in fact also experience some degree of labor coercion, right? Again, they do get some forms of money in some way or other, and that money is important to them and they don't want to lose it. But they also labor under a different form of coercion, which I call status coercion. Because at the heart of the power dynamics that I've been describing is the fact that the supervisors in each of these labor relations have the power to discharge them from a particular status. You can discharge an incarcerated worker from the status of prisoner in good standing, from a welfare recipient in good standing, from a college athlete in good standing, from a graduate student, right? And in discharging them from that status, they can deprive them of the rights, privileges, and opportunities that that status confers. Now, for these workers in particular, because they don't actually occupy the status of worker, which is kind of set out by the dictates of my research design, they're not legally deemed to be employees under employment law, right? So they are other things, not employees. And so they don't have access to the cultural and legal standing and the rights and the protections that employment status gives to regular workers. Instead, they occupy these other statuses, each of which comes with its own obligations, its own constraints, rights, and privileges, however attenuated, right? Now, to be sure, such statuses are not always desirable. I'm not trying to say equate status with elite, right? This is just a position in society, a position in an organization. But once in it, right, the statuses aren't desirable, but once you're in it, you need to maintain your status in good standing. So, for instance, behind bars, when you're living behind bars, retaining your status as a prisoner in good standing is of utmost importance because it gives prisoners access to all of those human entitlements behind bars. They can see their family and friends. They can have connection to other people, which is the foundation of human lives. It also gives them access to activity and recreation and freedom of movement, albeit constrained. It also gives them access to money, food and consumer goods, and also early release from prison through parole or commutation, right? You only get parole if you've been good, if you're a prisoner in good standing. If you haven't been good, you don't get it. So even though prisoner is not a desirable status, as it in fact imposes many more constraints than privileges overall, when you are actually living behind bars, maintaining one's status as a good prisoner is desirable indeed. Now, the other statuses I examine here are similar, for even when they impose constraints on their worker occupants, they also offer important rights and privileges. For workfare workers, being a welfare recipient in good standing is a prerequisite for their continued access to key safety net programs and even homeless shelters. As one New York City guy that I talked to, if you were sanctioned from welfare and living in a homeless shelter as he was, you'd be kicked out of the homeless shelter. So not only will you end up homeless, even if you're already homeless and have a space in a shelter, you're going to end up on the streets if you're sanctioned. Meanwhile, for the Division I college athletes, occupying that status in good standing gives them access to subsidized university education and the credentials it confers, as well as the chance to play the sport they have worked so long for, and for some, professional recruitment opportunities, and for the very few, perhaps even fame and fortune. Likewise, being a graduate student in good standing offers access to subsidized graduate education, as well as high status credentials, experience, training, and professional opportunities. So even though these statuses don't confer the right to a minimum wage or the right to collective bargaining, as with the status of worker, these statuses do offer rights and privileges that are highly valued within these respective institutions. Yet in each of these cases, supervisors have the capacity to revoke such rights and privileges, the consequences of which extend beyond the job and the wages it confers to affect these workers' lives, families, and futures in far-reaching ways. Now, in fact, these four groups of workers are not the only labor relations that are characterized by status coercion. Oops, I didn't finish my little boxes over there. There are lots of other jobs have at least some degree of status coercion as a part of it. So for instance, non-citizen workers such as guest workers and undocumented workers. For those workers, employers have de facto power of deportation. They can, effectively call the feds and say, oh, I've just discovered my worker is illegal, and they'll come and deport them. So they have de facto power of deportation. Thus, these employers have power over their status as either worker or criminal, and the privileges and punishments that each status yields. But the status coercion is not relegated to these more unusual or irregular types of work. Many conventional, regular, run-of-the-mill workers also experience status coercion, at least to some degree. So at the most basic level, for regular workers, if you're fired from your job or if you lose your job, you're laid off, that means that you are ejected from your status as a worker in society, right? And the considerable rights and privileges that that status confers. This loss of status can have considerable psychological and even physiological consequences, in addition to economic consequences, especially for those who are culturally or financially expected to be breadwinners, right? If you believe that you should be the breadwinner of your family, if your neighbors and family look to you to fill that role and then you lose that role, that is a loss of status. Now, for many workers, though, this loss of status is temporary because they're free within constraints, to be sure, to find and accept other employment. For most workers, then, the threat of losing income, right, the economic coercion, typically overshadows the threat of losing one's employment status or the status coercion, right? But both of these are in effect for lots and lots of workers. But this is in fact not always the case for all regular workers. So in the US, for example, a growing number of workers actually labor under non-compete clauses, which means that they've signed away their right to leave this job and work for another job in that sector. It started in the tech sector, but it's actually expanded to lots of different sectors, so that not all that long ago, the New York Times profiled a worker who works in tree service, like he cuts down trees. And he hadn't realized it, but when he got that job, he signed a non-compete clause. And he only, after he left his job, and then his employer came after him for trying to find a job in another tree service company, that he was unable to do so. And so in those instances, not only do bosses control workers' access to wages and benefits, but also their ability to leverage their labor market experience and obtain future employment in their field, right? If you sign a non-compete clause, if your employer says, well, you got to sign this before I hire you, you can't use your skills and experience to find other employment in your field of expertise. This is status coercion, right? So it's not only economic coercion that they experience, it's also status coercion. Okay, so that's kind of the basic overarching analytical framework of my book, the big argument, and there are lots of sub-arguments in there. Now I want to spend some time examining workers' experiences of this type of coercion. For prisoners, for incarcerated workers, the coercion that pervades their work lives is perhaps best described by a man named Garcia. And I should say that all of these are pseudonyms chosen by the interviewees themselves. Garcia is a 27-year-old Black and Hispanic man, and he described to me the Hobson's choice that prisoners face between work and solitary confinement, which again he calls the box. As Garcia said to me, the worst thing about working while incarcerated, I would have to say is, well, pretty much being forced. You're forced to do that work. It's up to you whether you don't look at it as that, but at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, you're forced to do all that. Like, you have no say-so. Sorry, that's hard to read. Either you do it or you're going to the box. Either you do it or you get your ass whipped and then you go to the box. So it's really like they rule with an iron fist. You can rebel, but there's still going to be the same result. And these workers did rebel in both large and small ways. They can push back, but if you really push back at all, the result, as Garcia says, is you're going to get your ass whipped. They pull the plug, officers descend upon you, you're met with real physical violence, you're taken to the box, where you can stay for an indefinite amount of time, usually at least 30 days, which again exceeds the basic line of torture. So they do rebel, but for the most part, I find that these technologies of coercion that these workers face are very effective in obtaining their compliance. They do what they're told because, as other workers told me, they just get tired of going to the box all the time. They get tired of the consequences because it's awful. This is illustrated, this compliance, the ultimate compliance, is illustrated in a story told by a former prisoner, Tim Jones, who is now 28 years old, African-American man. While in prison, like most of the incarcerated workers I interviewed, Tim generally worked in a variety of cleaning jobs, one of which included keeping the recreation area orderly. It's called a rec aide. One day at work, the corrections officer that was on duty out in the recreation area asked him to do something weird, something outside the norm, though at the time of our interview, Tim couldn't quite recall what it was. In describing the request, Tim said to me, "It was just like some things you ask people to do outside their job description is like, okay, I'll do it, no problem. I'm not doing too much out here anyway." But it was something he asked me that just seems like, huh? Like, excuse me? And I told him, I forgot exactly what it was, but I told him that it's out of my job description, my job title. And he said, "No, it's a direct order." And I said, "But I'm here at work though, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, you're at work, but I'm telling you to do it." As Tim told me, he then said, "But say, okay, what if I refuse due to the fact that it's not in my job title and I'm supposed to be technically at work?" And the CO, the corrections officer, said to him, "I'll put you on the wall." And Tim said, "You put me on the wall, then what? What's the outcome?" And the CO said, the CO said, "If I put you on the wall and you even flinch, you're not going to make your date." And I'm going to explain this in a minute. Tim said, "I'm not going to have no good time regardless. So what are you trying to say to me?" And the CO said, "You know what I just said." Okay, so although by then, at the end of this conversation, Tim had ascertained the meaning of what the CO was trying to tell him, for those of us who have not lived behind bars, it takes a little bit of explanation. So the threat here, as Tim clarified in his exchange with the corrections officer, the threat was not losing his parole or time off for good behavior or good time, because as Tim said, he didn't have any good time. He was a parole violator. That was why he had landed back in prison. And as a parole violator, you're not eligible for parole. So he didn't have any good time coming to him. Although I should say that losing your sentence reduction for good behavior, losing parole, is an explicit sanction for not complying with an officer's orders. You don't get parole if you don't do what they say at every moment of the day. But the threat here was, in fact, an additional criminal charge with an additional prison sentence, as well as, more implicitly, physical violence. Now, in order to understand why, you should know that prisoners can be put on the wall at any time for any reason in order to shut down whatever is happening. And so being put on the wall means that you're spread out, your legs and arms are outstretched, and you're leaning at a 45-degree angle on the wall. You're on your tippy toes in kind of a precarious position, and you got to stay there. You can't move. Any move, because they're trying to stop whatever's happening. Maybe there's a fight in the yard. Maybe you did something wrong. Maybe you're threatening an officer. They're going to shut it down. They put you on the wall. You can't move. Any move can be construed as a threat. And what happens again, if you're threatening an officer, that's the worst thing you can do, essentially. That's a really big deal. They'll call all the other officers. They'll come down. They'll physically subdue you with real violence, take you to solitary. So what the officer is saying here is, if I put you on the wall and you even flinch, and then implicitly, I'm going to construe that as a threat, and you're not going to make your date, i.e., you're not going to get out of prison in time, because if you threaten me, I'm going to charge you with an additional criminal charge. You're going to the box and you're staying in prison longer. In the end, Tim did what the CO asked, but he also put in a request to change jobs. And later, he even asked the officer why he had treated him that way. As Tim told me, the officer said that he had been testing Tim's temper. Now in Workfare, If Pauline's supervisor had been trying to test her temper, she would be the first to tell you that she had lost that battle. Pauline is an older African-American woman, though she now works at a women's shelter. She used to receive public assistance, for which she was assigned to work 35 hours a week. Her first job was cleaning up at a nonprofit organization, and then later she had to pick up trash on the side of the highway. For this work, she received $374 each month in her cash benefits, plus food stamps. She said that doing Workfare felt like slavery, though less because of the lack of paycheck and more because of how Workfare's workers were treated while they were on the job. It was just degrading, she said to me, because they talked to you in any kind of way. It was just degrading. When I asked her to elaborate, she said that they would outright tell her that she was lazy, that she wasn't trying hard enough. They would say, well, if you don't want to work, what do you think? That you're going to get free money? And she would say, no, but I had a job before where I paid taxes. Now I'm just down on my luck. Later in the interview, she explicitly compared Workfare workers to those who have to do community service as part of their probation or parole. It's the same thing, she said, but for Workfare workers, it's like they're convicting you for not having a job. And I heard this sentiment over and over again. They felt criminalized, as if they had been criminals, as if they were out on probation or parole, having to do this service for the public. Sometimes they even have to wear signs designating who they are. But they're not criminals. They're just poor. One time, Pauline said, she had to miss work. She was sick. She called in advance saying that she couldn't go. But because she didn't have a doctor's excuse, they cut off her benefits for 45 days, which again, under TANF means that she lost 45 days of her lifetime allotment of such benefits. Then there came a hot summer day when she was out on the road outside of a rural highway, picking up trash in the summer heat. She said that she felt like she was going to faint, so she asked for a drink of water. Her supervisor, who drove the work crew out to the highway every day, would let her. It wasn't break time yet. She said to him, as she told me, but they even give water to thirsty dogs. Can I just have a little bit of water? He would not allow it. Break time was not for another 15 minutes. So she disobeyed him. She went to the van and got a drink of water anyway. He saw her, of course, and made her sit down for 10 minutes, which she did. But after the 10 minutes was up, she got up to go back to work because she knew that if she didn't do the work, no matter what the reason, right? Even if he had been the one to tell her to sit down, but if she didn't do the work, he would mark her as non-compliant, which would mean that she would be sanctioned again. And this time, because it would be her second offense, she would lose 90 days, 3 months of public assistance. But as she got up to go back to work, he said, did I tell you to go back out there? By this time, as she told me, she had had enough. She lost it. She said, I'm about sick of you yelling at me with your smart mouth. As she told me, he then said, I'm not the one who needs this. You're the one who needs this. I get a paycheck every month. So she told him where he could stick his paycheck. In the end, he made her sit in the van for the rest of the day. And then when they got back, she didn't go sign in with social services and she never contacted them for assistance again. She gave up on public assistance. She lost all of her cash benefits, her food stamps, her Medicaid. She was unemployed and homeless for 8 or 9 months until she finally found a job in a bar, which she actually found a bit distasteful. As she told me, I would rather work in a bar than go through that. Even though I wasn't making that much money, I wasn't being disrespected like that or treated like I'm a common piece of trash, because I'm not. I'm not. Thus, for both Workfare and incarcerated workers, the possible punishments they face, as well as the degradation and subjugation they face on the job, are severe. And that is a key point of difference between them and the two student groups of workers in my study. Yet, as we will see, the punitive sticks they face are similarly broad, reaching well beyond their immediate jobs and their immediate paychecks to affect their health and futures. So for athletes, as I said before, the most pervasive possible punishment they face is simply losing playing time. As Mike Smith, a white former basketball, told me, he said, if you're not performing well in practice, if you're complaining or you're an issue, you're just not going to play. Like, it's just a given. And even when I would ask initially players about, like, what can coaches do? They never they almost never even said losing playing time. Like that is just so obvious to them that not being able to play if you complain in practice is like a given. But for many of these athletes, the possibility of this punishment is significant. They want to play. They are in college. Many of them are in college in order to play. This is what they came here to do. And like I said before, because the vast majority of them will not go on to play professionally, this is their only chance. And so their coach's power over their once in a lifetime opportunity is both omnipresent, but simply a given. But in fact, their coaches have even more power than that. And this is, you can see this from the story of Bruce, who had a pretty horrible experience, by far the worst experience of the athletes that I interviewed in this study. Bruce is 33, he's white. He was a football player in college. He did not have parental support for either his education or football, so he started off going to a junior college with the hope of being recruited by a larger school and getting a scholarship after his first year. And he worked his butt off to make this happen. He woke up at 4 a.m. every morning to go do speed training with a special coach, which he paid for out of pocket. And then that year he funded himself. He went to the NFL scouting combine, which, well, it's a big competition and they like rank you. And there he ran one of the fastest times in the country. And so when he went back to school after the combine, he was assuming that there would be interest from bigger schools, but he didn't hear anything. No one was recruiting him, at least as far as he knew. But in point of fact, they had tried. As an assistant coach finally told him, the other coaches from other schools were contacting his coach, which is par for the course. There are lots and lots of rules in the NC2A about recruitment, about whether athletes can talk to other coaches, and there are lots of limitations on what they can do. So they were talking to the coach to recruit this star player away, but his coach was turning them away because his junior college was actually turning into a 4-year college, and the coach didn't want him to leave. He wanted to keep him there. When Bruce found out, he was very upset, but by then recruitment season was over. So the last minute he contacted a few schools, and the next year he actually he left that school. He went to a state school as a preferred walk-on, which meant that he didn't have a scholarship, but he could still play on the team. When he first got there, he started at the bottom of the depth chart, meaning like he was ranked worse. But after just 3 days, he had jumped to the top because he was in fact very, very good and very fast. And so he earned a senior starting position that year. And he played very well for the remainder of that season. And at the end of the year, as Bruce told me, he went into the coach's office and the coach said something like, "Wow, we've never had a walk-on come and contribute the way you have. We're going to give you the first scholarship that opens up." As Bruce said to me, he said, "I'm like crying. I called my mom. That was like the greatest day ever. I was like, finally, now I don't have to work on the side. And, I can kind of relax and I can kind of focus on what I'm doing here in school and spend more time studying than on my part-time job. It was the greatest moment," he told me. So then after summer break, he came back to school and he went to his coach and he said, "Hey, like, I don't know how the scholarship thing works. I mean, how do I get my books? What do I need to do for this?" And his coach said, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, but we never had a scholarship open up." Bruce's heart sank. As he told me, he could have given me one if he wanted to. He just knew that in the NC2A, you can't transfer without sitting out a year. And if you transfer your senior year, you're done. So he knew he had me there no matter what. He could use that scholarship to bring in another player. So it was more about him and the program than it was about me. And I was a starting player, like one of the good players on the team. But like I was asking other kids to borrow their meal cards because he didn't have enough money for food. That's pathetic. That should never be that way. And then Bruce's experience got even worse. He was badly injured, but he felt pressured to play through the injury, which made it significantly worse. If they hadn't pushed him to play, he said, he might have only needed minor surgery and gotten a medical red shirt, which means you can sit out that year because of an injury and retain that year of eligibility. There are lots of rules about when you do and can't get. But since he played, he lost that year of eligibility. So that's not what happened. As Bruce said to me, "You're always trying to make them happy, I guess. And if they want you to play and you're injured, then you're playing because you don't want to say no, because then you think, oh, well, he is in control. He can just not play me ever again. And if I have to transfer, I have to sit out a year. There are just so many variables, he said to me, like your education, your schooling, where you're at. There are so many things where you just don't want to mess it up. So you're willing to let them kind of control the situation. His shoulder finally got so bad that he couldn't lift his arm. He got an MRI and the muscle was actually torn 95% off the bone. Bruce couldn't play. He left the team. He left school. He didn't graduate. He had to work to earn money. As Bruce said to me, the coach acted like I quit on him, like I quit on the team and stuff. And I was like, I did everything for you. I hurt myself. And now my career's over and I really wanted to play NFL. And now I have all these student loans. Bruce ended up having major surgery, which the school did pay for. But even still, he ended up in major debt. He did eventually get back on his feet, but it took him a really long time. I look back at it, Bruce said later in the interview, and he said, there's no way I should have been set back like that behind in life and have to catch up so much. Now, for graduate students, their bodies are not on the line in the same way as athletes, but a number of them that I talked to had experienced pretty significant mental health issues. One experienced ongoing panic attacks for which she required medication. Another experienced serious depression from ongoing harassment from her advisor. For these students, in the sciences in particular, their advisors, who they often call bosses, like they call their advisors bosses, their bosses have three overlapping levers of power: their education, their publications, and their future employment. One of the things that I was surprised to learn in talking to these students is not that they can be kicked out, which I would expect, but also that advisors will prevent them from graduating. That their faculty advisors won't let their students leave the program. Ron, who's now a chemistry professor, explained it to me this way. He said, the thing with graduate students is they're terrible, right? They're crap. They're awful in the lab, usually until their final year. And then in their final year, that's when they suddenly learn skills like time management. And they learn, oh, wait, if I do two things at once, that will actually speed up the research. And so I've absolutely heard tell of advisors who have essentially prevented their students from coming up for their PhD defense because out of nowhere, they suddenly became productive. And they want to keep them on longer to get more production out of them. Because remember, in the sciences, in the labs, the professor is usually not doing a lot of work in the lab. They're busy trying to get money to fund the lab. They're writing grants and maybe buffing up, polishing publications. Their graduate students are the one who are they're the hands, the bench hands, doing the research. And they might have weekly meetings telling them what to do or telling them where they want to end up. But the graduate students are the ones who are performing the research, and that's their advisors' research. So their whole careers, the advisors' careers, their tenure cases, their promotion cases are predicated on their graduate students' research. You cannot have academic sciences without graduate student labor. And so when students become good, when they're productive, when they're rock star researchers in the labs, sometimes some advisors, not all of them, will say, oh no, you're not ready for your PhD defense. You haven't done enough research. Maybe next year, because they want to get more labor out of them. This actually happened to someone I interviewed, Scott. He got his PhD in molecular biology. He's white, 32-year-old man. He was actually the only graduate student in his lab for most of the time he was there, which is pretty unusual. And that slowed down his PhD defense, his PhD research. But then at the end of his time in graduate school, his advisor kept delaying his defense. As Scott said to me, I had 2 to 3 times the amount of experimental work compared to other graduate students, and my advisor kept shifting the goalpost further and further beyond what I still think would have been reasonable. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was used as labor. Thus, Scott found himself in kind of a catch-22, because on the one hand, his advisor kept delaying his defense, but on the other hand, his advisor had also said that when Scott's funding ran out, and Scott was mostly self-funded, though his advisor was also paying for 1/3 of his tuition. When his funding ran out, he was going to be out of the lab no matter what, whether he had defended his dissertation or not. So the risk for Scott was losing all of that research ending up 5-6 years later with no degree and no professional opportunities. Finally, at the urging of a postdoc who had joined the lab, he started documenting everything. He created an email trail. He started saving emails on off-site locations. He even got a recording device so that he could record what his advisor would tell him in person versus what he would say in writing. And he eventually went to the director of graduate studies, though only anonymously, because all of these students are terrified of blowback. In the end, the director of graduate studies helped him schedule his defense after it had been put off for 3 times. But even though he did finally graduate and he finally got his PhD, because of all that, Scott felt like he couldn't rely on his advisor for a recommendation. To this day, Scott said to me, if I'd asked him for a letter of recommendation, I don't know what would have happened. His fear, of course, was that his advisor would write him a bad letter, trying to sabotage his career for whatever reason, who knows? As Scott said, the vast majority of advisors are not like that. But for the ones that do decide to abuse their power, there's very little to stop it. And this is true for all of these workers and the punitive levers of power that their bosses wield over them. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. And for our online audience, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat box, whichever is easiest for you. Does anybody from our in-person audience have questions? Jerry, and perhaps Erin, if you could repeat the questions so that our audience will know what it is.
Sure.
Does the change in management structure affect things like most prisons have become privatized? Some universities have become privatized, or part of their work is by privatized grants and such. Has this changed this coercion?
So the question is whether changes in management structure, specifically the privatization of, say, prisons or universities, would affect this type of coercion. It's a good question, and I don't technically know the answer because that's not something I studied. I imagine that for the most part, not really. If anything, though, it could make it worse. The issue here is that for all of these workers who aren't really considered workers, there are no HR departments, effectively. I mean, technically there are in universities, but not for grad students performing labor in their advisors' labs. There's no boss's boss in prison, in Workfare, in universities, looking over coaches and advisors' power as bosses, right? There's no HR department breathing down their necks. And there's no one for these workers to turn to if something goes awry. And the thing is, when power is both a given and also unchecked, the situation is rife for abuse. So while not all advisors are bad, not all coaches are nasty, not all corrections officers are evil, some are. And there are just no checks on their power. And so one can certainly imagine that privatization can exacerbate that dynamic, because if you're a state employee, there may be more levels of bureaucracy that could maybe work as a check on that power. But so the answer is perhaps, but I don't know for sure.
Given the recent Supreme Court ruling that enables college athletes to share in some of the enormous profits gained by the NCAA, and thereby, I guess, conceivably lessening the coerciveness of their roles. Do you see any impact of that ruling on the other 3 categories of workers that you covered today?
This is an interesting question. So the question is, given the recent Supreme Court ruling that allows for athletes to share in some of the profits from their athleticism, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit. Will that decrease their coercion and perhaps also decrease these other workers' coercion? And so in answer to the first part of that question, I would say it does not actually decrease the coercion that athletes face in their positions as athletes. So what the ruling allowed for is that, there are all these private entities that can make money off of athlete success. Since the most common example is video games, where they use the image and likeness of these players. They take what they look like, they take their uniforms, they can't use their name anymore. But they have, so then you can go and play, I'm not a gamer, so I don't actually know, but you go and play a video game and you maybe can pretend to be these players or like put together a team and, right? And until now, all the money, and it was a lot, that, that these corporations, the video game companies could make, they would make it. And the athletes whose image and likeness are being used to generate this income got nothing. Okay, so the Supreme Court ruling now says that, you know what, they can make money on this side, right? Maybe you can run a camp in your name because you're an incredibly successful basketball player. And so I am Erin Hatton, fancy basketball player. I'm going to run the summer camp. All of Buffalo kids will come and pay me some money, and I can actually keep that money. Until now, they have not been able to do that. They have not been able to make a dollar, a dime off of their success, but lots of other entities have been able to. Now they can, but their success is predicated in retaining their position as a college athlete, right? And still, so their coaches still have power over that status, right? And really this money that we're talking about from the Supreme Court decision, that's outside of university walls. So it's about the corporatization of the athlete's success and their ability to kind of leverage some of that outside of the university. It's not about universities paying them. It's not about, and so their coaches still retain all of these levers of power that I've been talking about. They still can play them or not. They can still, you know, keep them on the team or not, keep them their scholarships or not. So I actually think that will have a real lessening of the coercion, unless all the other rules that impede their movement, unless they're able to say, wait, you're not treating me well, I'm going to go play for this team, right? There are so many rules that impose, that regulate their behavior in so many ways. Unless those are lifted, they're still pretty coerced. And so I also don't think that will really have any bearing. I mean, these other workers, these are such disparate groups of workers. And I don't think even the grad students who are on the same campuses, I'm not sure that that's going to have any bearing on their labor relations and the coercion under which they labor.
Are there any comparable dynamics between the faculty advisors and graduate students in the social sciences or humanities?
That's a good question. So are there any comparable dynamics between faculty advisors and graduate students in other fields? So in social sciences or humanities, not the hard sciences. Yes, absolutely, but to a lesser degree. So, but to be clear, always the advisor-advisee relationship is one of power. And anyone who argues otherwise is just deluding themselves. It's a power-ridden relationship. And the power is really, you know, it comes down to that advisor's ability to write a letter of recommendation, which can make or break a career. That's an incredible power. What differs across different disciplines is the labor part of it. So those relationships are not always labor relations, right? So even though there is status coercion in these interpersonal relationships, oftentimes, so in my field, I have advisees, and my relationship with them is infused with this power, to be sure, but they're not working for me. Well, no, I take that back. Sometimes they do work for me as teaching assistants. But in the sciences, they would be performing my labor. And so in the sciences, the whole relationship is a labor relationship as well as an education relationship. As one science professor now told me, like, it's a Venn diagram that completely overlaps. It's all work and education. There is no separation in the sciences. That does not happen in other disciplines. So especially in the humanities, you know, they may be working as TAs or doing a little help in your research on the side, but that's not their own work. That's not their own education. So it is different in that it's not a labor relation, but those relationships are infused with the same power dynamics that I analyzed. Oops. Okay, so let's see. We have a couple of online questions. The first, has the nature of coercion changed over time in history? I would think that with the advancement in civil conduct and legal ramifications, the degree of coercion has greatly lessened as we don't have debtors prisons. We actually do have debtors prisons. And there is indeed social support in spite of workfare. There are fair sentencing guidelines. There are more access to graduate education when compared with early 20th century and prior. And okay, I think that's the same person also posted a second question. I'm not sure if it's part and parcel of the first one. So I think that in broad strokes, yes, there is less coercion. We do have more regulations in place, sort of. But those regulations are pretty minimal. Like we really, for the most part, aren't super concerned. Take prison, for example. There are rules. There are rules in prison, and really, officers aren't supposed to do terrible things to prisoners. And yet it's also true that many people, if I gave this talk to them, would be pretty unconcerned about officers' power to put prisoners in the box for any form of noncompliance. Like, it is just expected. Like, we kind of think of prison as a black box and any punishment goes, including being put in solitary confinement if you don't do what the officer says. And I would strongly, perhaps not surprisingly, argue against that. Like, there is it being there is punishment enough. All the extra punishment that is loaded onto prisoners, included being able to be put in solitary confinement for years and decades at a time, which again is literal torture, should not happen anywhere, anytime, ever. And that is actually very much a contemporary phenomenon with the huge prisons that are called, oh crap, does anyone know? I'm now blanking on it. The prisons that are all max, super max prisons, that are all solitary confinement cells. We've built this prison, these vast, massive prison complexes that are all solitary confinement cells. This is new. This is different from the past, and this is worse. So while in some ways, some bosses' power has certainly been mitigated through legislation, often employment legislation, right? Through things like minimum wage and overtime and collective bargaining. For these workers, that's not the case. And in fact, also people can be kept in prison and jail when they can't pay off their debts. So the answer, Sarin, is probably yes and no. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to read Sarin's second question. In federal labor law, there was a great discrepancy between protection between traditional employees and other workers, such as independent contractors who may or may not be independent, and consultants. What is the evolution of protection for these workers from employer coercion as harassment, discrimination, pay inequity? Okay, I'm not sure that I totally understand the question, and if anyone got it, please explain it to me. Right now, what we see in this world of gig work and this versioning, I mean, there's always been gig workers and people who are working on the side, but now they have been classified as not employees, as independent contractors, which is often a farce. Not always. There are real freelancers who under law should reasonably constructed as such, but for many gig workers, legally speaking, they should in fact be employees and entitled to all the rights and protections that employees tend to get. And so what we see at this historical moment is that these workers are, especially in the context of COVID, where suddenly these workers, the Instacart drivers and so on, were deemed essential, deemed heroes, deemed necessary to keep so many people at home and safe and protected, while they were not. And they're scrambling to make a buck while potentially putting their lives at risk. Now with this renewed kind of recognition, understanding of their importance, of the work they do, of the work they have done in the context of this pandemic, they are fighting for the rights and protections to which they should be entitled. So there's no distinct evolution, really, like the whole history of labor relations. It is a history of battle, contestation, push and pull and push and pull, and getting rights and pushing for more rights. Any other questions?
So, you know, I think it's a fascinating framework to view these various groups. And, you know, obviously it's far from ideal. Do you have any, like, thoughts or, you know, is there a next step or is, you know, I guess I'm, you know, where do we go from here, I guess?
Where do we go from here? What do we do about this? I don't have any simple answers. I'm not necessarily anti-work. I think work is really a centerpiece of American culture. Americans believe profoundly in the importance and dignity of labor. And so really at heart, I believe that all labor should be accorded dignity, right? There should, and so that includes incarcerated workers. Should they be able to work? Yeah, maybe. Should they get decent wages for their work? Yes. Should they be able to get jobs outside of prison based on the work that they did behind bars? Absolutely. Prisons say that that happens. That does not happen. Should they be put in danger while they work? No, they should not. Should they be put in solitary confinement if they don't want to work? No, they should not, right? So I think that I'm not anti-work per se, but if we believe as a culture in the dignity and importance and value of work, then that should apply to everyone. And that's really where I come down. And so it would start with recognizing these workers who aren't considered to be workers, as performing productive and important labor, which we value as a culture, and then treating it accordingly.
Any final questions? All right, well, thank you everyone who's joined us in person and everyone who is joined us online. This is going to conclude our speaker night for July. Stay tuned, we'll be talking about our next speaker night. We're finalizing details, stay tuned and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to shut down the Zoom. Thank you all for joining us. And our in-person audience will chat a little bit more later. But thanks again to our online audience.